Montana Territory, August 1883. The sun had just started climbing over the Bitterroot Mountains when Sheridan Rose stepped off the stagecoach in the tiny town of Grady's Bend. Dust clung to the hem of her slate-blue skirt, and her hands, tightly gloved even in the heat, held firm to the satchel across her chest. She did not look around, did not meet the curious eyes of the townsfolk already gathering near the mercantile. She was used to stares. The stagecoach driver, an older man with a face like cracked leather, tipped his hat. "Sure you do not want someone to help you find where you are going, miss?" "I am fine," Sheridan said, her voice low but even. "Thank you." She walked with purpose, her boots crunching over dry earth until she reached the sheriff's office. The letter in her bag had been folded and unfolded so many times the ink had faded. It was from her cousin, now dead, asking her to come care for his children after their mother abandoned them, and he took a bullet in the ribs over a gambling debt. Sheridan had never met the children, but she had no one else, and neither did they. Inside the office, a tall man leaned back in a creaking chair, boots crossed on the desk. He pushed his hat up when he saw her, revealing warm brown eyes and a week's worth of stubble on his jaw. He looked like the kind of man who saw everything but said little. "You Sheridan Rose?" he asked. "I am." He stood, offered a polite nod. "Deputy Dawson McAllister. I was with your cousin when he passed. He asked me to look after the kids until you arrived." She gave a short nod. "Where are they?" "With me. I have a cabin outside town." Her spine straightened. "I would prefer to take them home." He studied her for a long moment, then said, "They have not had much peace. I think you ought to see them before deciding what is best." She hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. The ride out to his cabin was quiet. He did not ask questions. She did not offer answers. He drove the wagon slow, letting the horses pick their own pace. The land rolled out around them, wide and golden, grass bent in the breeze. The sky stretched bigger than she remembered from when she was a girl. "I do not like to be touched," she said suddenly. Dawson glanced over but did not look surprised. "All right. People think that means I am broken." He was quiet for a beat, then said, "Then they are wrong." She looked at him, really looked, but he kept his eyes on the trail. She let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. When they arrived, two children came running from the porch. One was a boy, maybe 8, with a mop of rust-colored hair and a gap between his front teeth. The other was a girl, smaller, 5 or 6, with dark braids and wary eyes. "Miss Sheridan," Dawson said, helping them down from the wagon. "This is Finn and Flora." Finn ran up to her with a grin. "You are our aunt." Sheridan stepped back before he could hug her. Her hands clenched. Dawson stepped in smoothly. "Let us give her a moment." "All right." Flora hung back, clutching a ragged doll to her chest. Sheridan knelt slowly, letting her gloves rest on her knees. "It is all right to be scared," she said softly. Flora's eyes filled, and she nodded. That night, Dawson made stew while Sheridan sat stiffly at the table, watching the children eat. Flora kept glancing at her, as if trying to decide if she was safe. Finn talked enough for all of them, going on about snakes and frogs and how Dawson had let him ride the horse once but only at a walk. After they were asleep in the loft, Sheridan stood outside, arms folded against the cool breeze. Dawson joined her, hands in his coat pockets. "You do not have to stay here," he said quietly. "There is a widow in town who could take them in." Sheridan shook her head. "They are my family. They need more than someone who shares blood." She turned to him, her eyes fierce. "They also need someone who understands what it means to be left behind." He nodded once, slow. "All right." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable. Then she said, "Most men try to fix me." Dawson looked out at the dark horizon. "I do not want to fix you." She glanced at him, uncertain. His voice was low and steady. "I will sit beside you quiet, Sheridan, as long as it takes." Something inside her shifted, not a tidal wave, just a small, steady ripple. The next day they worked together. She washed clothes while Dawson chopped wood. She showed Flora how to mend a tear in her dress. Finn convinced her to read him a story, and though she kept her distance, he leaned against her skirts like she was already home. That night, Dawson set out a second chair on the porch. She joined him without a word. They watched the stars come out one by one. He did not try to touch her, did not even reach close, but she felt something warm settle between them. "You do not think I am damaged?" she asked, not looking at him. "No. I think you are someone who has been through more than most and still kept going." She looked down at her hands. "I'm not sure I know how to let anyone in." "That is all right," he said. "I know how to wait." Her throat tightened. She nodded once. For the first time in years, she did not feel broken, just healing, and she was not alone, not anymore. The cabin's floorboards creaked faintly beneath Sheridan's slippers as she moved through the kitchen before dawn. A kettle hung over the hearth, water beginning to tremble with heat. She'd slept little, not because the loft above had been noisy, it hadn't, but because her thoughts wouldn't still. They circled, slow and persistent, like the hawks she'd seen riding the wind over the plains. A faint scrape of boots came from outside, and she glanced through the window. Dawson was leading the mare to the corral, his breath visible in the early chill. He moved with that same quiet steadiness he carried in his voice, no wasted motion, no sharpness. He didn't look back at the cabin, didn't need to. By the time the children stirred, the kettle was off and hot porridge was cooling in bowls. Flora padded in, her doll clutched in one hand, hair mussed from sleep. She climbed onto the bench without a word. Finn followed, dragging his heels and yawning like a bear. "Do you like bees?" Finn asked between bites, spoon tapping the rim of his bowl. Sheridan shook her head once. "They're useful." "That's what Dawson says." Flora's voice was soft. "They make honey." Sheridan nodded, and the girl looked pleased. After breakfast, Finn was out the door like a shot, chasing the hens with a stick he called a sword. Flora stayed close as Sheridan rinsed their bowls in water drawn from the barrel. The girl didn't speak again, but she stood near enough that her sleeve brushed Sheridan's when she reached for the towel. Later, when the sun was high, Dawson returned from repairing the fence line with a spool of wire slung over one shoulder. His shirt was damp down the back, dust clinging to the creases. He set the spool down by the barn and wiped a wrist across his brow. Sheridan stood near the porch steps, arms folded lightly. "Do you need help?" His gaze met hers for a moment. "Not unless you're fond of splinters. I've had worse." He studied her a second longer, then nodded. "Come on, then." They walked the fence quietly, tools between them in a worn leather bag. She handed him nails as he worked. The fence wasn't long, but it wound along a slope that caught the wind hard. Her skirt snapped around her legs as she braced against it. "You ever mend fences before?" Dawson asked without looking up. "No, you're careful with your hands. That's good." She passed him the hammer. "I was a seamstress before," he nodded as he drove a nail in. "Still are, I'd say." She didn't answer, but her throat felt tight again. By the time they returned to the cabin, the light was slanting gold. Flora had gathered a pile of rocks and arranged them in a circle near the porch, a crude pretend fire. She crouched beside it, humming tunelessly, her doll tucked against one side. Finn burst out of the trees a moment later, face flushed, holding a bird's feather. "Look," he ran straight to Sheridan, his hand outstretched. She took half a step back, then paused. Her eyes dropped to the feather, white with a black tip, trembling in the wind. She reached out slowly, palm open. "Beautiful," she said. He beamed and placed it in her hand. That evening, supper was quieter. The children ate sleepily, and Flora leaned against the table's edge, eyes heavy. After they were settled in the loft, Sheridan stepped out to the porch. Dawson was already there, sharpening his knife with a whetstone, the motion steady and slow. She sat beside him without a word. The night air smelled of pine and dry earth. An owl called once from somewhere beyond the barn. "You ask quiet questions," she said after a while. He looked over, the knife paused in his hand. "Some things don't need asking." She watched the sky. "I was engaged once, a long time ago." His expression didn't shift. He waited. He was a kind man, patient, but when I asked him to wait longer, he said he couldn't, that he needed more than I could give. Did you blame him? "No," she said. "But I stopped trying after that." Dawson set the knife aside. "You don't owe anyone more than you have." She turned to look at him. "You ever been married?" "No, why not?" He leaned back, stretching one leg out. "I reckoned if I did it, it ought to be for the right reasons." "Not just to fill a space," she nodded slowly. "That makes sense." The last of the sun dropped behind the hills and the stars came out cold and bright. Sheridan's voice was quiet. "I don't know what to do with someone who doesn't want to change me." "Don't do anything," he said. "Just let me be here." She looked at him, long and searching, then leaned back in her chair. For the first time, her body didn't hold itself tight as a wire. She let the silence settle around them like a blanket, and for a while they just listened to the wind. The first frost came early that year, silvering the grass before the leaves had fully turned. Sheridan stood at the edge of the field behind Dawson's cabin, her shawl pulled tight at the throat. The air held that brittle edge that made her joints ache, even though she was not yet old. She watched Flora gather fallen leaves into her apron, her small face flushed from the cold. Finn knelt beside a crooked stump, poking at it with a stick as if it might reveal some secret. The children had taken to the land quickly but not wildly. They moved like they knew it could turn on them. Dawson came up behind her, not close, just near enough for his voice to reach her without raising it. "Been thinking about the schoolhouse," he said. "There's talk of starting one again come spring. You ever teach before?" "I can read and write," Sheridan said. "And I know my numbers," he nodded, hands loose at his sides. "That's more than most." "Why ask me?" His gaze stayed on the pasture. "Because you listen first, and you pay attention to what ain't said." She let the silence stretch before answering. "That's not always a comfort to people." "Maybe not, but it's a strength." A gust of wind scattered the leaves Flora had gathered. The girl let out a quiet sound of frustration and dropped to her knees to start again. Sheridan stepped forward, crouched beside her, and held the apron open so Flora could gather quicker. When they returned to the porch, Dawson was setting a pot on the fire outside. The scent of onions and dried sage drifted up with the steam. He'd been drying the herbs since midsummer, bunches hanging from the beam above the hearth, turning crisp and brittle in the dry air. Sheridan laid out slices of yesterday's cornbread on a plate, brushing off the crumbs with the edge of her sleeve. Finn hovered nearby, eyeing the pot. "You ever been away from Montana?" he asked Sheridan, his voice casual. "I lived in Kansas once," she said. "When I was younger." "Did it look like this?" "Flatter, windier. The sky felt heavier." "That don't sound better." She gave a faint sound that might have been a laugh. As dusk settled, Dawson brought out a worn fiddle case. He didn't speak, just set it on the porch rail and opened it with care. The wood inside was scratched and dulled by years, but the strings were fresh. Flora stared wide-eyed. "You play?" "Some," he said. "Not well." He tucked the instrument under his chin, bow steady in his hand. The first note was thin but true. He played a slow tune, something wordless and aching. Sheridan didn't recognize it, but it pulled at her chest like something half-remembered. When he finished, no one clapped. The silence after was soft, like the air had thickened and wrapped around them. Sheridan rose, brushing her skirt smooth. "Where did you learn?" "My mother," he said. "She used to play hymns when we couldn't get to church." "She's still living," he shook his head. "Passed when I was 16. "I was 13 when I buried mine," she said. "Fever took her in 3 days. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, quiet as breath. That night the children slept soundly. Sheridan sat by the hearth with a mending basket, Flora's stocking turned inside out in her lap. Dawson brought in kindling and added a few sticks to the fire, the flames catching with a low crackle. "She's taken to you," he said, nodding toward the loft. "I wasn't sure she would," Sheridan said, threading her needle. "Children know steadiness when they see it. I'm not sure I've been steady. You've been here every morning, every night, that's what counts." She looked into the fire. "I've been thinking of staying through winter." He didn't react, just set another log on the flames. "You already are," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sheridan set the needle down. Her fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. "I've never had a place that felt like it wouldn't turn me out." His voice was low but sure. "This place doesn't turn anyone out who wants to stay." She looked at him, long and full. "I don't know how to ask for what I need." "You don't have to," he said. "I'll keep showing up." "Until you believe it." She didn't reach for him. But she didn't pull away from the feeling that bloomed between them, quiet and slow, like the fire catching deep in the wood, not bright yet, but lasting. The first snow came quiet and steady, veiling the grass in white by morning. Sheridan stood at the window, one hand resting on the sill, watching the flakes drift down like ash. Finn's boots were by the door, coated in dried mud from the day before. Flora's shawl hung from a peg, uneven where she'd tugged the stitch loose. Behind her, the fire snapped low. Dawson added a split log, then straightened, brushing his palms along the thighs of his trousers. "You ever seen snow come this early?" he asked. "I remember it once in Kansas," she said without turning. "But not like this. There it was harsher. This feels softer." She didn't mean the snow. He didn't answer, but she heard the chair creak as he sat down near the hearth. There was a stillness between them that had grown familiar, not silence from lack of words, but from the ease of not needing them. Outside, Finn whooped once, a muffled sound. Sheridan saw him tumble into a drift, then pop up with a triumphant grin, red-cheeked and reckless. "You think he'll remember this?" she asked. "I reckon he'll remember the warmth after," Dawson said. "The way it felt to come back inside." Sheridan turned from the window. Her hands had healed from weeks of mending and chopping and hauling, but her right thumb still bore the faint scar from catching it on a nail. She flexed her fingers absently. "Flora asked me about their father yesterday," she said, voice quiet, Dawson's brow furrowed. "What did you tell her?" "That he loved them best he knew how, but not everyone knows how to stay." He nodded once. "She didn't cry," Sheridan added. "Just nodded like she already understood. She probably does." Sheridan sat then, across the room from him, the rocking chair angled to catch the warmth of the fire. She pulled a length of dark wool across her lap, a new dress for Flora. She hadn't sewn anything for herself since arriving. Dawson leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think about what comes next?" "I used to," she said. "Now I try not to." He looked toward the door where the wind whistled faintly through the gaps. "I think about it more than I used to." She glanced up. "And what do you see?" He took his time answering. "Your name stitched into the quilt we use in spring, the children learning more than just survival, a quiet kind of life, but not lonely." She looked back down at her stitching. "There's a difference between quiet and lonely." "I know." Needle in hand, she paused. "I don't know if I can give what most men want. I'm not most men." Her eyes met his. "I know." He stood then and crossed the space between them, not close, just enough to lower himself against the wall beside her chair, not even touching the hem of her skirt. When he spoke again, it was low, even. "You don't owe me closeness. You don't owe me change." "You owe me nothing." "I want to offer something," she said, the words slow, like stone rolling downhill. "But it's not the kind you can name, not yet." He nodded. "I'll take what you give, no more." The fire popped. Sheridan bent over the fabric again, stitching in silence. The line came out straight this time. Later that night, with the wind rattling the shutters, Sheridan laid an extra quilt over the children before retreating downstairs. Dawson had poured hot water into a basin by the hearth. The room smelled faintly of pine and soap. He handed her a mug. Brewed from dried mint and something else she couldn't place, she sipped and sat. "Where did you learn to brew this?" "Traded with a Shoshone woman near the river last spring. She said it was good for settling the mind." Sheridan held the cup close. "It works." They didn't speak again that night, but when she rose to go to bed, she paused at the stairs. "I'm staying," she said. He looked up from where he'd been adding ash to the fire. "I know," he said, "but it's good to hear it from you." She nodded once, then went upstairs. And for the first time in years, she slept through the night. The snow deepened into December, and the days slipped by quiet and steady. Morning chores came before first light, and evenings ended with boots drying by the hearth and the scent of cedar lingering in the corners. Dawson added a small lean-to beside the barn, hammering through the cold with his head down and his breath white in the air. Sheridan spent her mornings teaching the children their letters by lamplight. Flora liked to copy words in careful rows, her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth. Finn took to numbers faster, though he pretended not to care. When she praised him, he shrugged and ran outside, but she noticed he kept the slate clean and the chalk stubbed short from use. One afternoon, Dawson returned from town with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He set it on the table without a word and stepped back. Sheridan hesitated before untying it. Inside, folded with care, was a bolt of calico deep plums scattered with faded gold sprigs. She touched it lightly. This wasn't necessary. He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe. I know. But I thought it might be something you'd use for yourself this time. She said nothing, but ran her fingers along the edge and folded it again with slow precision. That night she laid it beside her sewing basket. As the days shortened, the wind grew sharper. Dawson began making repairs inside the cabin, tightening shutters, stuffing wool into the window seams. He carved a wooden rail for the loft stairs, sanding it smooth by lantern light. Sheridan watched him work, her hands still for once. I never thought about what it might feel like, she said. He looked up. What's that? Having someone make things better without asking me to change first. He set the sandpaper aside. You've changed, Sheridan, but it's been yours to choose. She turned her face toward the fire. That makes all the difference. The Sunday before Christmas, they walked to the church house together, Flora between them and Finn darting ahead in boots too large for him. It wasn't a service, just a gathering. One of the ranchers brought his fiddle, and the widow Dawson had once mentioned passed out biscuits wrapped in cloth. No one spoke of hardship. They just sat close for warmth and sang until their voices cracked. Sheridan stood near the back, hands clasped in front of her. Dawson didn't crowd her, but he stayed close enough that she could feel the weight of his presence. When the older couple next to them whispered a blessing over the children, Sheridan nodded without looking away from the lanterns strung along the rafters. On the walk back, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Flora leaned against Dawson's side, half asleep from the warmth of the gathering. Sheridan carried Finn's hand without hesitation, his fingers cold but curled trustingly around hers. That night, after the children had been tucked in, she found Dawson outside splitting kindling under the moonlight. She watched him for a time without speaking, her shawl pulled tight, breath curling from her lips. I've been wondering something, she said. He paused, axe lowered. What's that? If I asked you to stay for good, what would you say? He set the axe down carefully, wiped his hands on his coat, and stepped closer. I'd say I already have. She didn't step back, not this time. I've never promised myself to anyone before. Not truly. You don't have to say anything tonight, he said. But if you do, if you mean it, then I'll be yours without hesitation. She reached up, unfastened her shawl, and set it over both their shoulders. Her hand found his slow but certain. I mean it, she said. And I want you to know that I do. He bowed his head, forehead resting against hers, the cold forgotten. Inside, the fire still burned low. When they came through the door together, Sheridan's hand never let go of his. By spring, the snow had melted into rivulets that traced through the pasture. The schoolhouse reopened on the edge of town, and Sheridan was asked to teach. She agreed under the condition the children stayed with her until evening. Dawson built her a new table longer for her sewing and their lessons. He carved her name into the underside where only she knew to look. They married on a mild morning in April, beneath a cottonwood tree that hadn't yet leafed out. Flora wore a pale ribbon in her hair, and Finn stood beside Dawson with a face scrubbed so clean he looked surprised by it. Sheridan didn't wear white, but a dress she'd sewn from the plum calico, simple, fitted, with a row of buttons down the back. She'd stitched every seam by hand. They said their vows in front of the children and a handful of neighbors. There was no music, just the sound of wind through bare branches and the soft murmur of the river beyond. Afterward, they walked back to the cabin, the four of them. Sheridan held Dawson's hand, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. That night, when the fire had burned down and the children were asleep, she stepped into the quiet room and reached for him without hesitation. He met her there, steady as always, but this time she didn't hold back. In the months that followed, the land bloomed. Wildflowers crept up along the fence line, the hens laid more regular. Dawson planted a kitchen garden near the porch. Sheridan taught reading in the mornings and sewed in the afternoons. Flora grew taller. Finn stopped pretending not to care about school. They didn't speak of the past much. There was no need. It was there in the way Sheridan leaned into Dawson's side during storms, and the way he always left the porch light burning until she came in. In the way he never reached for her unless she reached first, and how, more often than not, she did. They built a life not out of grand gestures, but out of the quiet acts no one else would notice. A rail sanded smooth, a coat mended before it tore, a hand held steady through the coldest parts of winter, and in every small thing, love grew not loud but lasting. They stayed, all of them. Together, always.